I'm not going to say anything new today. Sometimes, however, one feels a need to return to first principles. A prime example of a first principle that needs re-emphasis is the fact that we can learn without making any errors. That the classical learning curve does not describe necessary features of the learning process. That learning need not involve errors represents an advance in our understanding of ourselves that ranks with major advances in our understanding of the physical world, like the fact that the Earth is round or that the planets revolve around the sun. Try telling someone that children can learn without making mistakes and observe their puzzlement and disbelief. Although the discovery of errorless learning represented a major advance in our understanding of what we do and why we do it, behavior analysis has remained remarkably silent when it comes to telling the rest of the world what we know. It has even been remarkably silent when telling its own students what we know, how we know it, and how to use that knowledge. Therefore, a review of the fundamentals of learning appears to me to be necessary. What is learning? A behavior analyst would rephrase that question as, what do we have to observe before we can say that someone has learned? First of all, we have to see a change in behavior. The person must either do something he or she has never done before, or must do something under new circumstances than ever before. Second, the new behavior must continue. If someone does something just once and never repeats, we have no way of knowing whether anything has been learned. Third, the behavioral change must take place and continue because of its consequences, because of what happens as a result of the new behavior. This part of the definition differentiates learned behavior from developmentally induced behavior, from imitative behavior, and from other forms of behavior that originate without specific environmental consequences. Other animals, and probably humans also, become imprinted on their parents. They identify and defend their territory. They establish and maintain a position as boss monkey. They limit the kinds of items they consume as food, and so on. Although all these kinds of behavior are originally unlearned, they usually do become modified by their consequences and therefore acquire learned characteristics. The ever-continuing debate about nature versus nurture could be resolved by cooperative research that illuminates the role of each kind of influence. Defining learning as lasting behavioral change that results from the production of consequences makes it possible to observe learning while it is taking place, and therefore to measure it directly. Unfortunately, the traditional methods of measuring learning have yielded such variable data that mainstream psychologists have relegated the learning process to the status of a theoretical rather than empirical construct. This variability and consequent treatment of learning as a theoretical process has come about because of the traditional use of trial and error techniques for studying learning. People are usually said to learn most of what they do learn by trial and error. We are supposed to learn from our mistakes. Also, we are supposed to learn occasionally by insight. Solutions to problems come to us as an inspired flash, even without trial and error. Conceptions of learning as mainly trial and error, and sometimes as insight processes, are almost culturally ingrained in us. We place pupils in an environment, usually a classroom, that may or may not provide effective consequences, what behavior analysts call reinforcers for learning. Typically, we lecture at pupils. We tell them, listen carefully, take good notes, read your assignments, and study hard. Then we give them tests to find out how successful they've been at figuring out just what they are supposed to have learned from our lectures and books. The notion that learning requires either trial and error or insight has been used to justify the practice throughout our educational system of placing the responsibility for learning on the pupil rather than on the teacher. Teachers regard some pupils who fail to learn as unmotivated. Kids these days don't really care, they say. Or poorly prepared. They never learned anything in elementary school. Or just plain stupid. They don't make them these days like they used to. Sometimes they're considered to be brain damaged and therefore unfixable. People with mental retardation, autism, and so on. This standard system convinces many pupils that they do have something wrong with them, and they therefore stop trying. Traditionally, error measurement has been used to characterize the learner. Mental retardation is just an extreme case. Even our great universities do very little teaching. Rather, they select applicants who have already shown that they can learn in spite of the system, with the minimal guidance that lectures and textbooks provide. The more it perfects this selection process, the more a university frees itself from its responsibility to teach. The elimination of errors by trial and error is what the learning curve is all about. The so-called typical curve of learning shows pupils gradually and smoothly decreasing their errors and increasing their correct responses as they continue to work on problems. In classrooms, however, and more generally, whenever changing economic, cultural, or political conditions require new learning, the actual behavior that takes place while people adapt to new conditions has been remarkably thoroughly ignored. The learning curve is supposed only to reflect the true learning process, which is really supposed to be happening somewhere else than in the observed behavior. Why do educational theorists regard students' actual behavior in learning only as an indicator of something else? They leap immediately from data to theory because when they look at individuals' learning curves, they observe great irregularities and discontinuities within individual curves and huge differences also from individual to individual. Unable to manage the chaos of extremely variable individual learning curves, investigators construct smooth and orderly-looking learning curves by averaging the data from many individuals. They know, therefore, that the gradual curves exist only as abstractions. Here are some examples of averaged curves. Each curve showing the number of correct responses increasing over time. These hypothetical averaged curves differ in the rate at which the correct responses increase up to some maximum. Because theorists consider individual learning irregularities to reflect random variables, they treat as artifacts the great differences they observe within and among individual curves. Averaging hides that variability, permitting it to be ignored. The smoothed curve, although it represents no individual, is taken to represent the real learning process. The averaged trial and error curve gives the illusion that learning is a continuous and smooth process. The reasoning goes, because the actual behavior of individuals while they learn is disorderly, the learning process cannot be behavioral. It must be going on somewhere else than in visible behavior. An interesting byproduct of the conception that learning is not itself an observable process can be seen in the popular concept of the steep learning curve. In everyday speech, a steep learning curve is supposed to indicate difficulty in learning. Because a steep slope is hard to climb, difficulty in learning must be represented by a steep learning curve. As we see in the figure, however, the steepest learning curves actually indicate the most rapid learning. Correct responses increase rapidly before leveling off near some maximum. By placing the learning process out of sight, with no specified units of measurement, learning theorists have generated a most confusing public misconception of terms. A behavioral viewpoint considers learning to be not merely reflected in behavior, but to consist of changes in behavior itself, in observable and controllable relations between behavior and relevant environmental variables. According to this view, the variability in individual learning curves does not obscure the true process, but is the true process. By identifying rather than hiding the sources of variability, we can then make learning take place as unevenly or as smoothly, as slowly or as rapidly as we wish to make it. It is therefore true that the shape of an individual learning curve is not theoretically important. But this is not because the learning is taking place somewhere else. Rather, the learning curve is not theoretically important because direct control of relevant variables can make any individual learning curve take any shape we please. One potential shape of learning curves is of particular interest to us here. This curve shows a sudden increase in correct responses from 0 to some maximum. This is a discontinuous curve. Once learning starts, it becomes perfect right away. What has happened to the gradual learning curve? Where are the errors? We're particularly interested in this curve because it shows learning taking place without errors. Is there a learning curve here at all? Errorless learning is a concept that traditional learning theory does not know how to deal with, except to average the discontinuous curves so as to turn them into a gradual curve that's consistent with standard theory. Another way to deal with errorless learning, however, is to recognize that the theoretical gradual curve does not represent the real learning process at all, that it, rather than the observed curve, is the artifact. One problem here is that errorless learning is not what teachers and the general public usually see. That is why it's so important to publicize the many demonstrations of errorless learning that behavior analysts have made. It not only can happen, but we can make it happen. We can make learning curves as measured by errors disappear. Learning curves do happen, however. They are real. What do we say about them? If they do not measure some more lawful process within the learner, what do they measure? A fundamental consequence of the observation that errors are not necessary for learning is that errors result from the teaching process, not from the learning process. A direct consequence of this approach is the notion that learning curves measure not learners, but teachers. The errors that students make on tests provide assessments of teaching techniques. Learning will take place if the teacher sets up effective contingencies. Learning is the responsibility of teachers rather than pupils. This is the exciting, counterintuitive, radical conception that behavior analysis has failed to present to a world that needs a revolutionary approach not only to the education of children, but to adult economic, cultural, and political problems whose solutions will require us all to learn new ways to behave. What's the evidence for this far-reaching notion? There is so much evidence that it's difficult to understand why it remains so little known. It started with laboratory demonstrations with non-humans and continues both with laboratory and applied demonstrations with non-humans and humans. The kinds of behavior involved in these demonstrations range from relatively simple acts to some complex intellectual performances. Let's start with some seemingly simple learning by a non-human. A laboratory rat is placed in a chamber that contains 2 levers. The animal is pressing one of them. Just at the animal's lower left is a small tray into which pellets drop from the automatic dispenser that's mounted on the outside of the chamber. The animal can get a piece of food each time it presses the lever, but it has to learn this. If the subject is just placed in this situation with no preparation, it will show a gradual learning curve. At first, it will press the lever only rarely, but it will then press more and more frequently until it's producing food as rapidly as it can. In Skinner's original lever pressing experiments, however, the learning curves were not gradual. You will recognize these as individual cumulative response curves from 4 animals. The recorder pen moved horizontally from left to right as time passed, and moved a small step upward each time the animal pressed the lever. Once each of these animals started, it pressed the lever frequently and steadily. They learned suddenly, in an all-or-none fashion. Skinner's subjects did not show either irregular or gradual learning curves because he did not simply leave them to learn by themselves. He taught them. He made certain that they learned all the prerequisites, all that they had to know before learning to press the lever. First, he placed each animal in his chamber with no lever or food until its emotional responses adapted out. Before this unfamiliar environment had become safe, the animals were not capable of learning very much. Not even food would not act as a strong reinforcer. Then he taught the subjects that the unfamiliar pellets they would later receive after pressing the lever were actually food. He accomplished this by mixing the pellets into their usual food supply. Next, still without an active lever, he occasionally delivered a food pellet into a tray in the chamber so that the animal soon learned where to find food in this new environment. At the same time, the animal learned when food was available. It was to be found in the tray only after the food dispenser had sounded. Soon, whenever the dispenser sounded, the animal interrupted whatever it was doing at the time, immediately coming to the tray to collect and eat its food. Then the lever was introduced. The first time the animal pressed it, the food dispenser sounded, and the animal, as it had learned to do, went directly to the tray and ate. Reinforcement for pressing the lever was immediate. Right away, the animal returned to the lever and pressed it again. Between successive lever pressing responses, the animal paused only to eat. Its learning curve changed suddenly from a response rate of 0 to a high, steady rate of lever pressing. Before these animals were given the task of learning to press the lever, the teacher, the experimenter, made sure that they knew everything else that was necessary. They then learned immediately, without trial and error. The gradual learning curves some experimenters see with individual subjects in this lever pressing situation are still artifacts of averaging, a different kind of averaging. A gradual curve here would represent not the average of several different subjects, but of several different controlling relations. Gradual learning curves for lever pressing actually include the curves also for learning that the new environment is safe, that the pellets are food and can be eaten, that the pellets are to be found in the tray, that they are to be found there only after the dispenser has sounded, and that pellets can be produced by pressing the lever. The sudden or discontinuous curve shows only the last of these, learning to press the lever. Instead of making our laboratory subject, our pupil, find out for itself that lever pressing will produce food, and then pretending that we have taught it to do so, we make sure that it has first learned all the prerequisites, all the necessary relations between behavior and environment. The critical step is then errorless. Skinner's original demonstration of errorless learning was groundbreaking because it turned out to be so generalizable. Neither the particular pupil nor the particular response was critical. We have failed to make that clear to others. Let us consider another example of effective teaching. Suppose we have a child who wants to learn to tie her shoes. Wants to, of course, means that tying her shoes will be reinforcing. How do we go about teaching her? Do we just keep showing her and hope she will eventually be able to do it herself? That is how most of us learned most of what we know. Being shown or told by teachers and texts. It took considerable effort for us to learn that way to tie our shoes. Many of us stopped trying until we were older and better able to imitate the kinds of long sequences that we call behavioral change. A more skillful teacher might break the task into smaller parts and try to lead the child through from beginning to end. Children would be likely to learn more quickly that way, and not so many would give up. An even more skillful teacher, however, would lead the child not from beginning to end, but from end to beginning. The teacher would start by tying the shoe almost completely, asking the child only to complete the job by pulling the final loops tight. This simple act would produce immediate and substantial reinforcement for the child. Not only the teacher's reaction, wonderful, you tied your own shoes, but the actuality of completing the job herself. Then the teacher would untie the shoe and tie it again, but this time not quite so far. The child might now have to push one loop through the other, and when she did so, she would immediately be in a position to do what she had learned before, to pull the loops tight, and would again produce the reinforcers. In this way, the teacher would gradually work backward. Upon completing each new small step, the child would always be in a position to do what she had already learned, and would be able to go through the rest of the sequence successfully. This is the backward chaining or back chaining technique. It's most effective for teaching skills that consist of behavioral chains. The process, errorless all the way, ends with the child tying her own shoe completely. An extraordinary feature of successful back chaining is that the pupil goes through the whole procedure without making a mistake. This is real teaching. What happens if the child does make a mistake when we try to back chain a sequence? Do we return to trial and error, making the child try again and again, repeating the error over and over in the hope that he or she will eventually do it right? Do we use punishment? Do we give up? No, we do none of these. Instead, we revise the teaching procedure. We assume that our teaching has been deficient, not the child. We break the difficult part of the sequence into smaller components, asking the child to do less at that particular point. For example, instead of expecting her to put one loop entirely through the other, the teacher may start by putting the loop through most of the way. Gradually, she asks the child to do more and more, and soon the child is taking two separate loops and putting one through the other. Before we teach the child any new step, we make sure she knows how to do all that that step requires. We do not ask her to do anything until we have taught her the prerequisites. We meet another kind of behavioral chain in teaching children to write their own names. If we start with a child who can copy his name, here's an example in which we use back chaining to teach him to write it from memory. 8 numbered trials are shown here together, but each trial was actually done on a separate piece of paper. The left column shows the stimuli we presented to Stevie to start each trial, and the red letters in the right column show what he wrote every time. In trial 1, we asked Stevie to copy his whole name, and he did that. In trial 2, we gave him all but the last letter and asked him to produce that himself. Then in trial 3, we asked him to produce only the last 2 letters of his name. From trial to trial, we moved backward and asked him to produce more of the final letters until in trial 7 he did the whole name himself, and in trial 8 without even the lines denoting where each letter goes. If a pupil makes a mistake during back chaining, we assume that we have failed. We improve our own teaching methods. When we do that, the errors disappear. For example, if Stevie has trouble with the letter E, we go back and teach it separately. First, we give him the whole letter to copy. Then, in successive trials, we give him less and less of the letter and ask him to fill in the rest. Finally, he does the whole letter himself without having to copy anything. And then we go back to teaching him to produce his whole name. A cause-effect relation is easily demonstrated. The learner makes mistakes, we change our teaching, the learner stops making mistakes. And again, if there are no errors, what happens to the learning curve? It just does not exist anymore, either in the behavior we can see or anywhere else. The notion that the gradual learning curve represents something going on elsewhere than in the learner's observed behavior gains a veneer of respectability when that elsewhere is claimed to be the central nervous system. Of course, changes occur in the nervous system during any behavior, and eventually we shall know exactly what does go on in the nervous system during learning. But what happens there when learning takes place is currently almost completely unknown. As far as explanation is concerned, we gain nothing by shifting the learning process from behavior and variables we can see directly and control to something we do not yet know how to look at. The problem, however, is even more serious. Those who claim that gradual learning describes what is going on are completely misleading students of the central nervous system who are searching there for the learning process. The gradual learning curve is a myth, and those who are searching for its counterpart in the central nervous system are doomed to failure. If instead they search for a process that can be described as all or none, on or off, binary rather than continuous, then when they find it, they will indeed illuminate in the nervous system what we have so far seen only in behavior. Even after we have taught the prerequisites for a particular response, like pressing a lever, we do not then just have to sit around and wait for the first response to occur and be reinforced, as we saw happening in the records of Skinner's early experiments. These first 4 animals took anywhere from a very few minutes to more than 2 hours before starting to press the lever rapidly. Later, Skinner showed us that we can bring the lever pressing response in much more quickly by reinforcing successive approximations, a process he called shaping. Since then, response shaping has become relatively well recognized and even applied more generally in animal training and in those few educational settings where the reinforcement principle is also recognized. It is less widely recognized, however, that a process we may call stimulus shaping can produce errorless learning of more advanced kinds of behavior than simple responses or even than stimulus-response chains. The pioneer experiments here were those of Terrace, who demonstrated that pigeons could learn errorlessly to peck a disc on which was projected a vertical line, and not to peck when the line was horizontal. In preparation, Terrace made sure that the birds had learned some prerequisites. For example, where to find food, to look for food only after the dispenser sounded, to eat the food quickly, and so on. They also learned to peck a lighted disc to get a little food, and then to peck only when the disc was lighted and never when it was dark. Next, he taught them to peck when the disc was red, but not when it was green. He was able to teach them the red-green discrimination errorlessly, but I won't describe that procedure here. Then, with the pupil, the bird's behavior controlled by colors, pecking whenever the disc is red, never when it was green, Terrace tested several ways to transfer the control from colors to lines. Peck only at a vertical line, never at a horizontal line. I'll describe only 2 of his procedures here. One procedure was trial and error, marked, as illustrated here, by an abrupt change of the stimuli on the disc from colors to lines, vertical instead of red and horizontal instead of green. The colors were no longer presented at all. The pigeon now received food only after pecking a vertical line. Although the pigeons finally did learn to peck only the vertical line, they sometimes made thousands of errors in the process, pecking the horizontal line and getting no food. In a second procedure, the teacher changed the stimuli on the disc gradually rather than abruptly. Instead of just removing the colors and substituting the lines in stage 2, he first superimposed the lines on the colors. On some trials, a vertical line appeared on a red background, and on others, the stimulus was a horizontal line on a green background. At the beginning, the pigeons could still peck correctly on the basis of the background color, without paying any attention to the lines. Then, as trials progressed, the colors gradually disappeared from the disc. Fading out from trial to trial, until the background became black and only a vertical or horizontal line remained. Again, the pigeons learned to peck only the vertical line. Now, though, instead of making thousands of errors in the process of learning, they made none. Even after the colored background was gone, they never pecked the horizontal line. Contrary to all previous observations in the laboratory, this was errorless learning, not only of a new relation between a specific response and its consequences, but of a new discrimination, a new relation between a response and its environmental context. Cognition refers to the control of behavior by events that precede or accompany the behavior. Cognitivists say that our behavior expresses meaning or comprehension. Terrace established stimulus control over the bird's pecking responses by vertical and horizontal lines, aspects of the pigeon's environment that were previously meaningless. Vertical now means that horizontal produces food. That pecking produces food. And horizontal means that it does not. The pigeons can be said to have acquired new knowledge errorlessly via stimulus shaping. The gradual learning curve that we do so often see is an artifact, the result of inadequate control over the learning process. The fading technique has the special virtue of showing that the continuous process is really located not in the learner, but in the environment. The material being taught changes gradually. The pupil learns suddenly. Continuity resides in the teacher's behavior, not in the pupil's. To recognize this is to shift the study of learning from the supposed characteristics of the learner to the characteristics of the teaching process. The proper study of learning becomes the study of teaching. As one might expect, the methodology for teaching those with retardation has been revolutionized by backchaining, fading, and stimulus shaping, and other more advanced techniques for teaching errorlessly, like stimulus equivalence and exclusion training. Practice, however, has lagged far behind the demonstrated possibilities. Schools of education, encouraged by most departments of psychology, continue to turn out teachers who are unaware of the new technologies. The discovery that learning need not involve mistakes by the learner has made possible a new set of tactics for teachers, the field of programmed instruction. The simple principle that provides the basis for effective programmed instruction is the same principle that underlies effective instruction in general. First, teach all prerequisites, all the behavior-environmental relations that are necessary for the desired learning to take place. A pupil will then take each new step forward without errors. The system for teaching the prerequisites is the program. The effectiveness of programming has been demonstrated in and out of the laboratory with non-humans, with intellectually retarded and other disabled pupils, with children, and with highly capable adults. Again, practice has not kept up with possibility. Programming makes learning easy for the learner, difficult for the teacher. Most difficult for many teachers is not the preparation of materials for errorless instruction, although few have been trained to do that, but rather the notion that they must accept responsibility for the student's success or failure. By removing from inside the pupil those variables that foster or prevent learning, and transferring them to the environment which the teacher provides, we make possible the direct observation, measurement, and evaluation of the teacher's behavior. Accountability is frightening, and not just for teachers. If responsibility for a pupil's failure can be avoided by shrugging one's shoulders and saying, "Too bad we can't just see what's going on inside that pupil's head," then many teachers are going to resist the loss of that protection. One can program errorless learning by teaching prerequisites. Is this really such a revolutionary notion? Who would try to teach children to write words without first making sure they had learned to write letters? How many teachers would have children with retardation write letters without first making sure they could hold a pencil appropriately, could make marks on paper, and then could make simple lines and curves? Teaching such elementary forms of behavior is a program of instruction. Programmed instruction, however, is not just something with which to help teach children or people who have difficulty in learning. It works right through high school, college, graduate school, and into specialized education. For example, in developing a programmed text on neuroanatomy for medical students, my brother and I tested the material many times in order to discover which text items were causing the students to make mistakes. When we found many errors on a particular item of the program, we were able to eliminate the errors usually, not by revising that particular item, but by revising material that had come before, sometimes long before. We almost always found that we had taught prerequisite information badly, often by just presenting textual or graphic material without requiring the student to base some behavior on that material. Completing a diagram, reading a cranial cross-section, and so on. By teaching that particular prerequisite more effectively, we were always able to eliminate or gradually reduce the later errors. In a near final test, we gave the neuroanatomy program to a group of medical students who were just beginning the course. As they went through the program in class, we observed them becoming very disturbed, grumbling, moving about noisily, asking questions in hostile tones. The problem finally became clear when some of them spoke out directly. Said, "This is too easy. You must be trying to fool us. You said this was not going to be a test. What's the catch?" Like most students, they'd been brainwashed. Learning had to be difficult. They were making no mistakes in going through our material. How could they be learning anything? Good teachers threw difficult material at them and made them work to learn it. They could not conceive of the possibility that a teacher might be trying to teach, to arrange conditions so effectively that learning might take place errorlessly. They eventually found themselves doing this. You can see various labels for parts of the brain. They learned how to provide the appropriate labels for the parts we indicated. Or the next illustration, which shows them locating the parts that we labeled for them. They were able to do both of these things without ever having made a mistake in the 40 items to which they had been exposed before. They discovered that they really were learning, but in a way they had never experienced before, and they all relaxed. It was a wonderful thing to see. Over the next 40 years, more than 150,000 learners used this text. We had promised a second volume, a promise we were unable to keep, and we have received scores of letters from students thanking us for the first volume and volunteering to be subjects during the test for Volume 2. Programmed instruction, with its emphasis on errorless learning, is living proof that learning curves are artifacts of inefficient teaching. Although never being recognized by educators as a useful teaching tool, it is an underground favorite of students. Given what behavior analysts now know about the learning process, I believe it's a professional obligation for all of us to pass this knowledge on, not only to our students, but to the general public, and probably through the general public to the educational establishment. Thank you.